Get it out. Get it out.
The top of this episode is just going to be screaming over and over. Those are the outtakes. Hello, and welcome to SnarkSquad Pod, a media podcast full of friendship, feelings, and snark. My name is Marinez.
I'm Nicole Sweeney.
And I'm Devin Hinchy, and I talk about books on my Instagram at @FTheCanon.
And in addition to being a friend who is very smart about books, Devin is also my friend who is an expert on all things Shakespeare, like literally went to grad school for it. She's very, very smart, unlike us, a bunch of lowbrow idiots. So Devin is going to do the plot synopsis because this week we are talking about the Netflix movie The King.
Yeah, I'm gonna do my best to give it a synopsis because this movie's long. If anybody hasn't watched it, it's long. So fair warning. Okay, so we open in the early 15th century on Hotspur in his post-battle glory, where we are told exactly what the movie is going to be like because he stabs a guy who was just trying to crawl away. We then get to meet the current king, King Henry IV, who's introduced to us as a coughing and obviously dying old man. He still has some kick in him, though, because when Hotspur refuses to hand over his hostages from the battle we just saw, he threatens to kill Hotspur. And just like that, we move over to Eastcheap, which is the neighborhood where our young Prince Hal, the title character, the king, is woken from a drunken sleep to perform a surgery on Falstaff for some reason. A court official calls on Hal to come to the palace because his father has summoned him, and Hal refuses until Falstaff convinces him to. And when Hal gets to the court, King Henry IV only summoned him to let him know that he's not going to be king. His brother Thomas will be after he leads the army to battle against Hotspur. Hal takes a moment to try to convince Thomas that these aren't his battles to fight, and Thomas ignores him, and we're gonna go fight Hotspur now. So Hal shows up on the battlefield and sends a messenger to Hotspur to offer to stand in the army's place and have the men fight one-on-one. After a bit of a chat, he accepts, and Hal kills him within a few minutes. Thomas gets really mad that Hal took this moment from him, and everything backfires because then Thomas goes on to die in a battle a few days later, and Hal is going to be king. Then, Hal shows up at the palace as his father is dying. In a totally grown-up and mature move, he pulls the bedsheets off his dad so he can die shivering and cold. And all of a sudden, we have a new king. For anybody who's following along in the plays, that was it. That was Henry IV parts 1 and 2, done in 30 minutes. So after the death of King Henry IV, we move on to Hal's coronation and a celebratory dinner that they're having where he hands out some gifts he's received. And we get the first rumblings of issues with France when the Dauphin sends King Henry V a ball as if he's a kid. It's very insulting. Hal's Lord Chief Justice William tries to convince him to respond to the insult, but Hal really can't be bothered and would rather undo the damage his father did as king first. We then have a moment with Hal's sister where she warns him that men are often untrue, so there's some very not subtle foreshadowing for you there. We get a moment of seeing Falstaff in Eastcheap, seemingly forgotten by his best friend, the new King Henry V, and obviously he's feeling pretty hurt by that. Back at the palace, a French assassin has shown up and been apprehended, who was supposedly sent to kill King Henry V, but he doesn't succeed. And King Henry V sends a letter to the King of France saying, "Hey, if you send assassins, we're going to go to war." And he sends back the box from the Dauphin, but now it's filled with gunstones, which is basically ammo. We later see King Henry's cousin, Cambridge, and the Lord Grey being approached by the French about how unfit the king is. And when the Lord Chief Justice tells Henry this, Cambridge and Lord Grey are beheaded, and war is declared on France. Oh, we're not even through it all. Okay. So after war is declared, Hal travels back to Eastcheap to get Falstaff to come to war with him because Falstaff has a respect for war that the other men in the court don't have. Falstaff agrees and becomes a captain in the upcoming battle. The army then heads off to France. They take a castle under siege. The castle surrenders. Prisoners are taken. And we're off to the races. The Dauphin, played by Robert Pattinson and his French accent, shows up in the middle of the night to explain to King Henry that he's going to die and be buried under a small tree. And then there's a penis joke, because Shakespeare. The English army immediately begins moving, and then the Battle of Agincourt starts to begin. The Dauphin beheads some kids so the English know that he means business. Hal calls for a mass execution of their prisoners in response, which Falstaff refuses to do. And the War Council meets and Falstaff decides the plan on how they're going to attack and possibly beat the overwhelming French army that they're facing. Falstaff ends up leading the first wave of soldiers, which pulls the French army out to meet them, and then the English are able to get the upper hand, and a very long, very stressful battle ensues. Think the Battle of the Bastards from Game of Thrones. The Dauphin meets Hal in the middle and calls for him to fight man to man, as Hal had suggested they do before the battle began. And the Dauphin makes a fool of himself and just keeps slipping in the mud. Hal finally puts his sword down and super coolly nods for his men to kill the French prince, and England wins. Hal goes to see the King of France, who offers Hal his daughter as a prize, and so the countries can be united. Because who doesn't want a free princess? And then back in England, they're about to start celebrating the Agincourt victory, and the soon-to-be queen throws it in Hal's face that her father never sent an assassin, and the battle was totally not worth it. So Hal goes to see his Lord Chief Justice William, who's been pushing him to go to war for the whole movie, and he deduces that the assassin that the Lord Chief Justice brought to Hal was in fact a plant in order to get the war moving. Hal gets really mad and kills William, and then we go back to the happy couple, and the crowd is chanting for their king, and the movie closes.
You did it.
That was the movie.
So just to be clear, it's 3 plays then wrapped up into that one plot.
It is 3.
Well, I guess on that note, that's a good summary and way to lead into our first question and where we always start. And that is the question of whether or not you liked this. So, Devin, we'll start with you. Did you like this?
So as a movie, I enjoyed it. As an adaptation, I did not like it.
So I have only the most cursory school background with Shakespeare, and as such have no feelings whatsoever about it as an adaptation. And as a movie, I was largely ambivalent.
I also have no feelings about it as an adaptation, and it did give me a lot of thoughts as like I was watching and thinking about like this podcast as a project, because I was thinking like, wow, I would like to have more feelings about this, but the truth of the matter is that I just was bored out of my mind. And you know, we do plug ourselves on like leading all of our media discussions with our feelings, so I am sticking with this, that the main crime I think that this movie committed was being a lot not for me. Like, I don't know why I picked this to be on the podcast, because there was really no world in which this would have been like enjoyable to me. But on top of that, I also think it was just slow and boring. So my answer is no, I did not enjoy it.
Okay, so before we get really into this conversation, I do have to ask Devin, as our Shakespeare expert, and I, as an ignorant loser, you mentioned the dick jokes in your plot synopsis. Just to be clear, are there in fact a ton of dick jokes in Shakespeare?
Yes. There are so many dick jokes in Shakespeare. So many. If you think it's about a dick, it's definitely about a dick. Like, that's the rule when you read Shakespeare.
I did not study Shakespeare, and I have not read Shakespeare probably since high school, but I vividly remembered being in like high school classes laughing at all the dick jokes and just driving our teachers insane, because that's literally what we were there for. I was like, that's a dick joke.
Little post-it arrows on all the dick jokes.
Yeah. I think that we will get to this as an adaptation, and mostly that will be the section in which Devin shares with us all her beautiful thinky thoughts. But first, I think that we should tackle this as a movie. And we are all at least lukewarm or under. So let's start with positive things. Was there anything about this movie that you did enjoy?
Joel Edgerton, for sure, is the thing that I most enjoyed about this movie. I liked his character the most. I felt for him the most. I was really sad when he died. And I just really enjoyed the dynamic between him and Hal. I liked the sort of role that he was playing as both a close friend, but also sort of a, father figure in the absence of an actual relationship with his actual father, I did care quite a bit about the sort of, I don't know, I volunteer as tribute-esque moment in which Hal goes to try to save his brother. I think that there are some problems with that beginning section of the movie that made that not work as well as it could have, but like, you know, sibling feels for sure. I also really enjoyed Robert Pattinson in this movie. I wasn't sure, like it took me a bit. I had to sit with it and think about how I felt about it, but I think around the time that he shows up is about the point where the movie started to really pick up for me. And like from his arrival forward, I was much more invested in the movie and like genuinely laughed out loud at him sort of slipping around in the mud. I don't know, in a movie that felt joyless. That was an unexpected and fun moment.
Yeah. Robert Pattinson, I really enjoyed him. And like when I saw the stills for it, I was like, okay, but he did really good. I really enjoyed him, and I like on a movie side, it was beautiful. I thought like the shots were composed well, like a technical lighting standpoint and like cinematography standpoint, it was very pretty. Yeah, that's maybe where it ends. I wasn't completely bored by it because this is stuff that I watch in my free time, so it doesn't bore me. But I think Joel Edgerton did a great job. I think Timothée Chalamet did okay, but the thing I really, really loved about it was just how pretty it was. Like I could have put it on mute and enjoyed it more.
I will +1 Joel Edgerton. I think that he did an amazing job. Amazing is kind of strong, but I think comparatively there was something a little like bland about the other performances. I don't even remember who I was talking to with Nicole about, and she described them as being a little dead behind the eyes in this movie, and I was like, yes, like everybody else. Yeah, like just a little on the bland side for me, whereas this character, like, I don't know, I felt and believed him, and he had some funny lines and things of that nature, so that was like the highlight. I think I was very, very bored until we got to the battle scene, and just everything about the battle scene I thought was more interesting and well choreographed, and it piqued my interest. But of course, we were almost done with the movie at that point. I'm trying to think positive things.
I will also co-sign the battle scene being a very strong part of the movie for me. I think this ties back to my fundamental ambivalence because this is not something that I generally care that much about in movies or in TV. Like, I don't know, I just, battle scenes are not really my jam. However, this one I think was a really good one. And they did a very good job of showing you the whole plan playing out, the way that they were cutting back and forth between Hal and, you know, all the men dying and the sort of first guard and whatnot. So all of that I think worked really well.
And the haircuts were so bad. They were good. I'm going to put haircuts in my list of positives as well.
Even at the beginning when he's facing off on the one-on-one with that first guy, and the dude comes out and he's like, "Bring out the big dog," and Timothée Chalamet is like, "Dup, dup, dup, dup." Like, he comes out, like, no, stop! You're not convincing me. I don't believe this.
I forgot about that scene. That was good.
All of the blocking in this movie was really interesting because it felt like they were frequently trying to film him from like underneath to make him look taller, and
they were trying to make him look like the big bad warrior.
The idea of him and Robert Pattinson facing off is like, I mean, fundamentally ridiculous. Like the idea of these two, I don't know, notoriously soft boys fighting felt absurd to me. But like also Robert Pattinson is so much bigger than him. Like I don't know, that sort of hand-to-hand thing. I don't know. But like the way that they were shooting him felt like they were trying really hard to cheat that in some kind of way.
Yeah.
You have one of them sit the whole time. Even while making lots of threats, he just sits calmly.
Yeah, I kind of believed him there. I was like, maybe you will kill him. Even though like I knew what was going to happen. Like I was kind of sat there going, I believe you a little bit.
I will say that there was a lot of this that was like very broody, but I think that it was almost like a quieter kind of broody. Like I would have liked to see the broodiness and the angst like taken up a few notches. And it was interesting to me that you mentioned like how pretty and well shot and all of it was, but I don't feel like I took the time to notice that because I was so bored, but also like the entire aesthetic was kind of just desaturated and muddy, and it just like captured my whole experience. Like, this is just muddy and desaturated and boring. Like, I couldn't see past like, oh, this is also like well shot and well constructed, because I was just, I don't know, way too deep in my not being interested.
Well, they were leaning really heavily on things being broody, like even bringing it into the lighting, like you said. That's a really good point, because yeah, they 100% did that.
Honestly, I think my biggest problem with it is pacing related, and we're not to the point of talking about this as an adaptation, and truly this isn't like an adaptation based complaint for me, because I'm not saying this because of how it compares to the source material, rather like a guess at why it feels this way. But I think you can feel the fact that they smashed the two plays into one at the beginning, or sorry, not into one, but rather into such a short time frame at the beginning, because all of that sort of backstory for this character felt incredibly rushed. And it's frustrating for me because there are some emotional beats there that would have been really instrumental for me in connecting to the story, but they were all rushed through, so I didn't end up actually connecting with them.
I think it's interesting because we get taken into a whole journey following this like boy king or whatnot, but I'm not sure what the buy-in or why we were supposed to care about him was. I think the shorthand for that at the very beginning, I mean, apart from it being an adaptation and a historically inspired thing, but like, it's like, this kid doesn't want to be king. And I was like, okay. Like, I don't like, boo-hoo. You don't want to be king, and now you're king. Like, I don't know what, like, how or why we were supposed to care about him necessarily. I don't know.
No, I think that's true, because I was trying to think of it, because I was like, this movie was made for like a couple thousand people around the world who will love it, who will think it's wonderful. But I'm not sure who those people are, because I think it's made for people who enjoy like a technically well-produced movie, who have maybe a slight understanding of Henry V's story, but no one else.
While I obviously relate to this essential complaint of not knowing why you're supposed to care about this character, I will push back just the tiniest bit in defense of the movie, because I do think that it tried to give reasons and explanations for why you should care about this character. It's not just, oh, he doesn't want to be king. He doesn't want to participate in, needless wars, and like he wants to, save his brother, but then ultimately like he fails to save his brother. He becomes sort of famous, and like his legacy is this war that he ultimately does participate in. So like, I don't know, all that to say that there did appear to be more going on there than just he didn't want to be king. But I also understand why you feel that way, because I think that all of that was presented much too quickly in sort of the larger scope of the movie.
And I mean, the first 20 minutes was probably where we were supposed to, learn who this character was and why we should care about him. And, anything beyond, like, it was just like cursory nods at doesn't want to rule, cursory nod at likes his brother, cursory nod at doesn't like the politics of his father. And it was just like so quickly done that none of it really, I don't know. I'm getting like frustrated with myself just because I'm like, I don't know. It was just boring. And that's like all I have to say.
Yeah, I think the movie, like you guys were saying, it rushed you into feeling something. And so then you just gave up and you didn't feel anything, because it was like, no, I'm not going to follow you on this weird rabbit hole you're taking me down. So yeah, it was a choice.
Maybe it was hoping that you would just be like, yes, Timothy.
Yeah.
Like,
I can't be like that on account of how I am an adult, and he looks like a little boy. Like,
he does look very young in this movie.
Also, unrelated to all of this, I just looked it up, and apparently Timothy Chalamet is actually 5'10", and I don't
know.
My mind is blown, because in my head he's just very tiny.
the joke of me at 5 feet tall calling Timothy Chalamet tiny.
Well, now I'm just like, why didn't they shoot him like he's 5'10"? Like they could have shot him in regular ways. Like if he's 5'10", that's fine.
All right, Devin, this is your moment. Now, what about this as an adaptation missed for you?
Okay, I'm going to break your guys' hearts for a second. So,
okay.
Joel Edgerton plays Falstaff. Falstaff is an exceptionally famous and popular character in the Shakespeare world. And the Falstaff from Shakespeare is absolutely nothing like what was created for this movie.
Oh, no.
Like, not even a little bit. So Falstaff is actually a character who's known for being exceptionally large. He's known for hiding from any conflict that might arise. He's basically a foil to all of the structured characters. He's just there to be drunk and be at the pub. He has never been a warrior. He is not a respected soldier. He is not that wise. Like, there is, I feel like because Joel Edgerton produced this movie, he saw that Falstaff could be more, so he wrote Falstaff to be more, which I respect. And I think that was a good choice in terms of like making the movie more willing to be appreciated by the audience. But yeah, that's not Falstaff. He went completely off base for that. In the plays, Falstaff isn't even in the battles. Falstaff we're told as the audience that he dies at the start of Henry V. So shouldn't even be there. And he gets banished by Henry V at one point. So nope. That's not the character. But I appreciate the changes that he made in the sake of the movie. But you lose a lot by changing Falstaff that much and changing him away from the foil character that he plays. Some other things they lost was a whole bunch of characters. Anybody who's read Shakespeare knows there's sometimes too many characters, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. You'd lose a little bit there by removing those storylines. In the battle where Hal fights Hotspur, that is something that happens, but Hal is not trying to save his brother. He's in fact trying to save his father, which is a change. The brother does not factor into these storylines in the play, and the battle with Hotspur doesn't actually happen until the end of Henry IV Part 1. So you get to build up the relationship between Hal and his father before Hal shows that he's willing to sacrifice himself for his dad. So you lose a lot of emotional depth there, especially for you to like rush through the emotional payoff with his brother. There were a couple of scenes that are like particular favorites of mine that were cut for the sake of the movie. I don't like that, but that's okay.
Sure, that's fair. That is the adaptation complaint as old as time.
That is, yeah.
Right.
And so it's like and it's totally personal, but like a couple of them, there is one particular scene where Hal, while his father is sleeping, basically takes the crown off of his dad and puts it on himself. And his dad wakes up and they get into this big blowout fight. And I think that could have been really good in this movie in terms of like building the emotional depth between those two characters. But it got cut. In the play, the assassination attempts are real. And they are done by 3 of Henry's closest friends. They are not things that are planted by the Lord Chief Justice. So that's a change to make. And there's in the plays, there's like no direct interaction between the Dauphin and Hal. So they definitely built those scenes. But that is one thing that I will say, I preferred that. I preferred that Hal and the Dauphin had those face-to-face moments because you saw Hal get properly insulted and annoyed that he was being insulted. But as far as adaptations goes, this is something I would call a revisionist adaptation. So they basically took the play, they revised it, they changed things around, and they created basically an entirely new storyline. So that's why I don't know that I would call it. It is technically an adaptation, but because it changed so much and it compacted so much from the plays, it's a little rough for me. So all of the things that you guys are mentioning about like not having the emotional attachment, that makes sense. Because when you take 3 plays and you drop it down into one, albeit long movie, but one movie, you lose a lot of the emotional depth, and it's a bummer. So obviously there were like a lot of changes that they made to the story, which was, as someone who studies Shakespeare in their spare time, because it's fun, it is rough to take. But I understand why they made the changes they did, because I looked a little bit into basically what started the creation of the king. And Joel Edgerton said, for lack of a better word, it's Game of Thrones meets Shakespeare, only in that you can watch Game of Thrones and understands what's going on. I feel like with complete deference to Shakespeare, there is something that happens when even the most intelligent people watch Shakespeare. They feel stupid. I have feelings about that. So adaptations of Shakespeare are an amazing, amazing, amazing thing. Anything that makes Shakespeare more accessible to people is fantastic. If you watched The King and you loved it and it made you want to read Henry V, wonderful. I can recommend editions for you. But there is a lot to be said when someone creates a movie for the sheer fact of reducing a text to make it less smart, quote unquote,
Yeah.
And I think there's, when it comes to Shakespeare, we say it all the time. Like, you get told all the time in class, Shakespeare's hard. You're going to have to spend a lot of time digging through it. And stop saying that. Don't say that. Like, when you set people up for something to be too difficult for them to follow, it's going to get really difficult for them. Mm-hmm. But I think there are better ways to create adaptations than to come in it with the feeling of, I want to make this more accessible to people because the language is more accessible. The language can be accessible regardless if the acting is done well. So there's a lot to unpack there, and if I keep talking on my soapbox, you guys are gonna be sitting here for 4.5 hours. But yeah, it's tough,
and it totally tracks for me, even as somebody who's like hasn't read Shakespeare in a very long time. But that if you approach any work with the like attitude of, I'm gonna make this less, that's kind of like a thing, especially for people who are fans of the original, that would be like a knee jerk, like, no thank you,
right?
Even though, like, as you're saying, that the entire idea of adapting Shakespeare and introducing it to new audiences and generations and making it more accessible is like an amazing thing. But I feel like I don't know, you always want to feel like there's a certain like respect for like the original work and like working from there.
Absolutely. And that there's a respect for the audience.
Respect and accessibility were the two sort of big words that popped up for me just in hearing you say that. Like, I think that the way to do, I think that there is a version of that comment that wouldn't upset me, and it's purely a like tone and framing thing. So like there's a way of saying, we want to take this material and make it more accessible to people in some sort of way, is very different from saying it will make you feel stupid if you don't consume it this way. Like that, those are two, it's saying the same thing but coming from such a different place that it means something fundamentally different.
Yeah, and like Joel Edgerton has worked with Shakespeare before, so I respect him as a voice, coming into this discussion. But yeah, that was one of those things that I was just like, dude, come on. Well, and it's everybody wants to talk about adaptations when we talk about Shakespeare, because Shakespeare text can be a little dry. Even I can admit that. But Shakespeare's plays themselves were adaptations. Majority of what Shakespeare wrote did not come from his brain. It came from history. It came from folklore. It came from previous tales. So you're making an adaptation of an adaptation, and that's a very difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm. I think that also probably, like, had I read that comment before watching, I probably still would have been like, well, that's weird. But especially so after watching, because I feel like your product, like, you've made it so less that it's basically nothing. So you played yourself, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And they also tackled a very difficult story to tackle in one movie. So this was based on what's called the Henriade plays, which are Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V. They ignored Richard II entirely in this movie, which was a good choice. It would have been too much. But then they busted through the Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, which is really where you learn to love Henry V, as a character and as a king. And they just jumped right into Henry V. So you ended up not loving the title character in your story. And that's... you guys saw and experienced, it's very difficult for you to attach yourself to someone that you don't have an emotional response to.
This is going to be kind of like a hard turn on this conversation. Thank you for coming to our podcast about the King. Now we will be talking about other Shakespeare adaptations, but I'm curious, are there, Devin, other Shakespeare adaptations that you enjoyed more, that you would recommend, or that you think achieved making one of the stories more accessible while still respecting the audience and being true to the spirit of the thing?
Absolutely. And I'm going to mention everyone's favorite movie, 10 Things I Hate About You. So 10 Things I Hate About You is so good at doing exactly that. You never felt like you lost respect for the characters, or you never felt like you lost any part of the story, despite the fact that it's done in modern English, in a high school, in Washington. It's a masterpiece. I'm going to say it. It's better than The Taming of the Shrew. It's better.
I agree. Yes.
Sorry, Billy.
Yeah.
Listen, 10 Things I Hate About You is perfect.
It is. It's 100% perfect. And there are a lot of adaptations that are done well. The ones that I have listed, something to note, none of them are the histories. And the Henry plays are part of Shakespeare's history collections. They're extremely difficult to do in adaptation. The ones that I think are good are movies like West Side Story, which is Romeo and Juliet. And then, of course, Romeo plus Juliet, which you guessed it, is Romeo and Juliet. If you want to expand a little bit, you can Throne of Blood, which is done by Akira Kurosawa, and that is Macbeth. And even She's the Man, which was Twelfth Night.
Yes.
So they're
I love the
so
She's
good.
the Man shout out.
She's the Man is underappreciated. She's the Man is great. And then if you really want to go for it, The Lion King, which is the story of Hamlet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but there are so many adaptations out there that do it well. And I think for me, the more I look at these lists of adaptations and I look into them, it's that it's very difficult to do the historical plays as an adaptation. But give me a romance and give me a tragedy in an adaptation, and I am there.
Right. That it's a lot easier to sort of pluck out the necessary threads.
Yes.
When you're trying, because especially if you are adapting it into a movie where you will have less time and trying, so you will have to streamline some things. So, yes.
I guess, too, because when you are adapting, a history thing, I would assume that your tendency would be to preserve the events. So we got the showdowns and the battles, because that's part of the history building block. And it feels like that's true here. Obviously, I was not in the writer's room or at all involved in the making of this movie. But it was giving priority to the events, and it totally just put the emotional depth and the character development off to the side. And I wonder if that would make more sense to you when you're adopting a history without,
The history is like you said, it relies so heavily on the actual events that happened, whether it be in the play or the actual historical fact. If anyone's wondering, the Henriade plays are not entirely true to historical fact. So bear that in mind. But there's also something that I found most adaptations, or the adaptations that I've participated in, I guess you could say, are ones that they fully change from the text. And I think The King didn't change enough. They took this play that happens in the early 15th century and they set it in the early 15th century. And whereas if you are looking at things like West Side Story, 10 Things I Hate About You, She's the Man, they're taking the storyline and they're completely putting it in a different century with a different cast, with different characters, and they're making that full change. And I feel like The King just like watered down the Henriade plays and called it a movie.
I think that's a really good point, just in the way that the modernization approach to an adaptation makes it a lot easier for storytellers to streamline things, because so much is being changed that you then have more space and freedom to make the sort of necessary nuts and bolts changes that you also have to make in order to collapse the story down.
Yeah, absolutely.
It also, I think, from an audience perspective, puts a more distance at the top of the thing between you and the original. I wonder if it's like easier for the audience to process, like, this is inspired by, but different from that thing.
Right.
Which also gives you leeway as you're watching. Which, if this movie had been animals with singing, voiced by Timothée Chalamet and Robert Pattinson, like, I feel like I would not have been bored at all, is all I'm saying.
Get Joel on the phone. Let's remake it, everybody.
Listen, Joel, we have a proposition.
And it's a choice for me. Like, personally, when you say you're adapting Shakespeare, the first thing I want to question is wonder what you're going to do with the text itself, because the text of Shakespeare is what makes Shakespeare. So if you change it entirely, that doesn't bother me. 10 Things I Hate About You is one of my favorite movies. But you can also do it really well without changing the text. And Romeo plus Juliet does that. You know, They change the setting. It's all of a sudden in Venice Beach. They have guns. Like, it's a completely different setting. But they kept the words the same. And I don't think anybody was lost during that movie, because the acting's good. Like, there's a lot to be said for good acting and actually watching the play happen. The mistake that we all make in high school, or are told to make in high school, is to read the plays. Don't read the plays. Go watch the plays. They are so boring to read. Why are we doing that to our children?
I hope somebody takes this into their high school and plays it for their teacher. Be like, Miss,
excuse me?
This girl named Devin on a podcast said.
Y'all can cite me, because I will stand by that till I die.
And on that note, thank you to Devin for joining us this week, and thank you all for listening. If you are enjoying this podcast, consider sharing it with your friends or rating and reviewing it wherever you are listening to this podcast. We'd love to hear all of your thoughts on The King. There will be a post dedicated to this episode up on SnarkSquad.com. You can also sign up to join our community on Patreon at patreon.com/SnarkSquad. You can also find us on Twitter at Snark_squad. You can find me at My Name is Mighty Dis.
You can find me at Sweeney Says.
And I'm at Devin M. Hinchy.
This podcast is produced by Nicole and myself, and it is edited by Nicole, and the music is by Stefan Chin. We will be back in your feed again next week.
Bye.